All right, we're gonna step into the next. We're gonna step into tonight. What is tonight called? Tonight is called the God of Revival. And I'm so excited to just preach this to you. I promise you I'll take 15 minutes. That's all I need. One of the greatest revelations that God has ever given me is the following. My life changed because God was after me. I could have died when I was 8 years old crossing the street to go into a hospital, and literally while I was running, I felt a hand the size of my entire body stop me, and a car almost ran me over. It was an angel's hand. My life changed. I'm still alive because of it, because God was after me. I could have died in a drug overdose all alone in my own living room after smoking weed that was mixed with I don't know what type of chemical and other drugs, and I almost died, and I pleaded with God, God, please give me a fresh start. Please revive me. Please spare me, give me life. And I threw up this black stuff, and He spared me. You see, my life changed because God was after me. I would go in and out of church. I would go to different retreats, and God would encounter me, and I would have this fresh fire. And I would come back thinking and believing, and my attitude was like, man, I'm never going to go back to the world ever again. I'm sold out for Jesus. But then 2 weeks later, it was like I never had an encounter to begin with. And I went back to doing what I used to do and being who I used to be, even though that wasn't, and it's not the original me. So what's the greatest revelation? The greatest revelation is, even though my life changed because God was after me, my life changed 1 billion times more. Now watch this, get this. What type of life can be 1 billion times more better and greater than a life of God chasing after you? I mean, can you just picture that for a moment? I need somebody to play God. Can you just play God, Chris? All right. I want you just chasing me. Wherever I go, just come after me. As close as you can come. What type of life is 1 billion times better than God just pursuing you? What type of life is 1 billion times better than a life that God is after you, that God is chasing you? It almost seems like there can't be possibly any better life than this, to live a life that God is after you. You go to the club, you drive back home drunk, and you didn't die in a car accident. God is after you. You smoked the wrong drugs, and you almost died from a drug overdose, but God is after you. You didn't die. What type of life can be 1 billion times better than a life that God's chasing you? I'll tell you, it's a life where you're chasing after God, where it's no longer God chasing after you, but now you're chasing after God. It doesn't matter how tired you can get. I'm going to read the Bible. It doesn't matter if I fall asleep. It doesn't matter if 2 minutes into the worship song I'm thinking about my ex-girlfriend. I'm going to follow God. I'm going to chase after God. Can I tell you, my life changed 1 billion times more the moment I decided to pursue and chase after the God that chased me, that delivered me, that healed me. Somebody got to shout. That's what separates the regular believer from an Apostle Guillermo Maldonado. That's what separates, that's what makes the difference between a regular believer and a Benny Hinn, a Bill Johnson, whoever. That's what makes the difference. How much are you pursuing God? How much do you want change? That should determine how much you're chasing after God. Oh, I feel it now. I feel the anointing. I feel His presence. However amount of change you want, that should determine how much you're chasing after God. However much you want to be healed and sanctified and delivered, that should determine the level that you're chasing after God. Don't tell me you really want change and you're not chasing after the changer. Don't tell me you want anointing and be anointed and you're not chasing after the anointer. Don't tell me you want a new life and you want to be born again, but you're not chasing the one that can give you a new name and a new life. Don't tell me if if you really want to change, if you really want it bad enough, you are, oh my God, you need to chase after God. How bad do you want him to prosper you? How bad do you want him to change you? How bad do you want him to deliver you? What degree are you chasing after God? Because if you're not chasing after him, he's never gonna change you the way you desire to be changed. Because in the chasing is the reviving. Let me show you how this goes, and I'm about to close now. Because y'all so excited. Genesis chapter 28, verse 10 through 17. NIV, please. Are y'all ready for tonight's message? That was the introduction to this. When he reached a certain place, he stopped. We're going to read all the way to verse 17. If we can start at verse 10. Jacob, who? How many of you know who Jacob is in the Bible? Okay. Jacob left Beersheba and set out to Haran. When he reached a certain place, he stopped for the night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones there, he put it under his head and lay down to sleep. He had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you're lying. There's so much to say there, but I don't have time. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. Have you ever received a prophetic word you thought you wasn't ready for? Have you ever had an encounter with God and he just starts showing you things on why you were really supposed to be living and why you're really still alive and why you made it and why you didn't die? All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. Verse 15. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. I just want to tell somebody that God is just affirming that he's going to do what he promised to do with you. He's going to do what he promised to do through you. He's going to do exactly what he told you he would do back in that retreat, back at that house of peace, back at that campsite. I want to just remind someone of God's promises over your life, his declarations and his prophetic words. But let me teach you something. You want to know how all those things are going to come about? God has to revive you. Write this down. Your revival starts at your encounter. Or your revival starts at an altar. For some of you, listen, because I'm getting ready to finish. Your revival starts at an altar. For some of you, your altar was right here at church. For others, your altar was in the streets. Some of you, your altar was at a club. Some of you, your altar was at a house of peace. Revival first starts at your encounter, or revival first starts at an altar, at the altar of your life. Question, where did God meet you? Where did God encounter you? You see, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm going to just say this. God builds an altar. God builds an altar wherever you're at so that he can encounter you. But then he expects for you to build an altar so that you can continue to encounter him. And I want to speak to you a little bit tonight on what an altar means. Genesis chapter 35, verse 1. And with this, I begin to close. Then God said to Jacob, I need a Jacob. I need a Jacob to help me out here. Can we move the altar? All right, Jacob, here we go. This is Jacob. And Jacob represents the man that God is chasing. I want you to walk around Jacob. Jacob represents the man that God is chasing. He represents the mess up, the black sheep of the family, the one that always disobeys and likes to disobey, the rebel. Jacob represents the one that's kind of like, I'm not going to go to Remnant Youth on Friday night. I'm going to just go and hang out with some hoes. I'm going to just go out to a club and just drink and get drunk. And you see, Jacob represents the prodigal son. Jacob represents the Saul before Paul. Jacob represents the Simon before Peter. Jacob represents a depressed Albert, an immoral Albert, a dumb, a foolish Albert, a rebel Albert. Jacob represents everybody up in this room. Now I want you to catch this. Let's go back to the word. Then God said to Jacob, go where? Go to Bethel for what? And settle there and build what? Build a what? This is our beautiful altar that they've created. Build an altar there to who? To a female? To a little boyfriend? A job? A career? Build an altar to what? This is not part of the preaching, but in life you either worship or you idolatrize. Whatever you build an altar for, that's what you'll worship. He tells Jacob, go to Bethel and settle there and build a what? Unto who? Who what? When you were what? You know what I love about this verse? Jacob had an encounter before he had ever built an altar. You know what I love about this verse? That God, you know what the word and the name Jacob means? The name Jacob means a con artist. The name Jacob means a thief, a trickster. And you know what I love about this verse? Here is God telling Jacob, after Jacob encountered him back in chapter 26. So we're a couple of chapters after he had an encounter, after God showed him everything that God was calling Jacob to do, after God had promised him all the land and all the precious things that he was going to do with Jacob. You see, even though Jacob had an encounter, Jacob still went back to the world. Jacob still went back to stealing. Jacob still went back to his old ways. So God showed up again and told him, Jacob, go back to where I appeared to you. Another translation says, go back to where I encountered you. Go back to where I revealed myself to you and build me an altar. Do you know why God told him, go back to Bethel? Go back to the place where I met you. Go back to the moment. Go back to the memory where I touched you, where I set you free, where I delivered you, where you knew I was more real then than you did 5 minutes before I revealed myself to you. Do you want to know why God told Jacob, go and build an altar? Because God had already seen what happened to Jacob when he saw angels ascending and descending from heaven. And even though he had an encounter, it wasn't enough to revive him. You see, God will always release an outpouring to try to revive you. Listen to what I'm telling you. Stay with me. I got 5 more minutes. God told Jacob, go and build me an altar. Because if you don't build an altar, you can't sustain your revival. If you don't build an altar, you can never sustain what God does in your life. Give me a second, Albert. That's why for me, I would go to a retreat, catch on fire, and lose fire. That's why for me, someone will minister to me, I get delivered and lose my deliverance and still go back into bondage. You want to know why many of you, you're still struggling in certain areas in your life? You want to know why many of you, you have to make the same prayer we're making, oh God, revive me? You know why many of you, you've lost something or you've lost many things in your walk with God? Because you haven't built an altar. And if you don't build an altar, it doesn't matter if God hands it to you, you will lose it. Only if you build an altar where God met you is the only way you can sustain what God gives you. I came tonight to speak to somebody. If you want to sustain your deliverance, if you want to sustain your encounter, your healing, you got to build an altar. If you don't want to go back to pornography, if you don't want to go back to the life you used to live before He encountered you, you got to build an altar. You see, I want somebody to see this visually. The reason why God told Jacob, go back to the place where you encountered me. I want you to try to come back to me. Jacob, go back to the place that you encountered me and build an altar. Because if you don't, when you don't have an altar, you'll go backwards. Did you just hear what I just said? If you don't build an altar, you'll go backwards. As if you never even had the encounter to begin with. So God was pleading, almost begging Jacob, go back and build an altar, because if you don't, I know what's going to happen to you. I know you're going to go back to the world. I know you're going to go back to sin. I know you're going to go back to living and eating with the pigs. So I need you to go and build an altar, because I need you to sustain the deliverance, the blessing, the breakthrough, the healing that I've given you. God is telling you, build an altar. He's pleading with you, build an altar. Because if you don't, you'll lose it. Hold on. This is the best part. Exodus, and I close. Exodus chapter 3, verse 6 and 7. It's an encounter. It's an encounter where Jacob's revival started. It's an encounter where your revival starts. Listen to what I'm telling you. It's because Jacob built an altar why he became Israel. If Jacob would have just encountered God and that was the end of it, none of those promises would have came to pass. If Jacob would have not built an altar, he would have never became Israel. Without an altar, Simon would have never became Peter. Saul would have never became Paul. Oh, I'm going to preach to you these last 5 minutes. Exodus 3:6, I love this. After Jacob has an encounter with God and his revival starts and he's being revived. How do you know you're being revived? When there's change in your life, when there's transformation in your heart. And after Jacob has his encounter, builds an altar, and he becomes Israel, years after, someone say with me, years. Years after, another man by the name of Moses has an encounter with God. And God built an altar to meet with Moses so that Moses in return can do the same thing he asked Jacob to do. Build an altar so that Moses can continue to encounter God. Are you with me? But this is a revelation. He tells Moses, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham. Do you remember when God told this to Jacob? I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of who? Wouldn't you think that God would say, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel? Wouldn't you think that God would say, I am the God of Moses, I am the God of Abraham, I am the God of Isaac, and I am the God of the man who I changed, who I delivered and transformed? Wouldn't you think that God would brag about the man who built an altar and is no longer called by his old name but by a new name? But God doesn't tell Moses that. God says, I'm the God of Abraham, I'm the God of Isaac, and I am the God of a man named Trickster. I am the God of a thief. I am the God of a con artist. I want to tell somebody tonight, God is a God of testimony. He is the God of revival. You want to know why he didn't say I'm the God of Israel? Because he wanted to prophesy and tell Moses, what I did with a Jacob, I'm about to do with you.